Now, in the last session, we looked at the behavior of the use case add experts. To understand this behavior, we created this sequence diagram. Right? Now, let's look at the structure of the use case to support this behavior. Remember, we had already created a class diagram to identify the various classes that are required. Now, these classes would be called as analysis classes. Okay, and we don't really have to show the actors here. When it comes to these analysis classes, one thing we can immediately specify are the relationships, right? During analysis, we really don't have to be very strict about this, right? We just can show that there is some kind of dependency or some kind of relationship. Not here. Expert form 2. We know expert form talks to the expert manager, so there is some level of dependency. Expert manager talks to HRMS access. Expert manager talks to email access. Expert manager talks to subject. And expert manager talks to expert. Now, let's look at the properties of these classes, and more specifically these entity classes. As and when I add these properties, it will not be shown on this diagram because it is using the stereotype notation. So to make it not show it like this, I go to elements and say use stereotype icons. Remove it and say OK. So now it actually shows it as a class. Now let's identify the properties of, say, a subject. So we go to features and attributes. Let's add the attributes. What are the properties that we require? Those properties we store it as attributes. Now, when it comes to the subject, we require the name of the subject, coverage of the subject, right? The participants, the candidates have to be told that this is the coverage as far as the subject is concerned. Name, coverage, then what else to be required? Remember, a minimum number of approved questions is required. So, unless that minimum number of questions which have been approved are there, it cannot be used for scheduling of tests. So let's say is enabled. Now is enabled would be boolean, true or false. Name would be string. Coverage would also be string. Now, what happens if the subject is outdated, right? It is not required anymore. So again, for that, is active, which would again be boolean. Again, to enable it for testing, right, we need to have so many number of approved questions. So we require number of questions approved. Now, if that is the case, then we also require number of questions added. Let's say we later on we can remove them if we don't require it. But if we are having approved questions, then let's have number of questions added, then number of questions rejected, just to have a picture of subject wise the statistics. Okay, now let's look at expert. Now, as far as the expert is concerned, his name would be required, his employee number would be required for linking it with the to have a reference point to the HRMS system. Employee number, name of the employee, then we require his email ID. Most of the details would be there in HRMS. So we'll just duplicate those particular properties which are going to be frequently required, so that we can avoid communicating with the HRMS for these every time. Now, with respect to the expert again, we need to keep track of some information. So number of questions added, let's say by me. Number of questions approved by me. Now why do we require this? These we require because incentives are linked. So we need to have a count of this. Number of questions rejected by me. Okay, so this part we have taken care of as a reviewer. So these are properties as a reviewer. Now apart from that, added by me is not as a reviewer, right? So let's say number of questions added. As a reviewer, he can only approve or reject. Okay, so number of questions rejected. So number of questions which I added but which got rejected. Number of questions approved. Again, my questions being approved. Again, if we keep thinking about these things, there will be some additional properties that we may discover, which may not directly be related to this use case, but once you think of it, you might as well add it. For example, we know that for a subject, passing percentage, then during a test, the number of questions to ask. So number of questions to ask in a test. Okay. The timing in a test. Time allotted for test. These are going to be subject specific. Okay, so we added. Again, the moment you see this type of thing, is active, is enabled, it means there is some state related behavior. Now, to understand the state related behavior, we need to build a state diagrams, right? So to explore it a little bit further, now let's create a state diagram for subject, and we'll do it under subject itself so that they are all together. Add state machine diagram. Okay, so let's keep the toolbox open. Now we know that it will be is enabled and disabled. Similarly, active, not active, right? Now if it is not active, that means it is outdated. It doesn't really matter in which state it is in, whether it is enabled or disabled. It's only when it is in active state that we are interested in whether it is enabled or disabled. So what we can do is we can move this inside this. Let's make it bigger. Okay, so now it is embedded inside that state. Now let's bring in this as well. Okay, so what will be the initial state? So starting point when the object gets created would be the initial state. So when it gets created, it will be in active state, otherwise it won't be added. But more importantly, it will be in disabled state because it doesn't have enough questions, approved questions, right? From disabled state, it can go to enabled state. Now, irrespective of whether it is enabled or disabled, it can go to not active. So, when the substate doesn't matter for a transitioning out of a superstate, we show the transition from the superstate itself. Anything else? Can it come back from not active? Now, because whether a subject is dated or outdated, that would be decided by a person, right? Let's say a training manager. But this enabled or disabled can be taken care of by the system itself. Now, since it is through human intervention, mistakes may happen, so we need to provide the rectification option as well. So it can go from not active to active back. But in which state will it go back to? Now, to show that it goes back to the whichever state it was in, we can use a history state and show the transition to the history state. There are various other events that are happening, right? If you think about it, somebody will be approving questions at some point in time. Approve question. So when he approves a question, what happens? Number of questions approved plus plus of the subject. Is there a condition that has to be satisfied? No. He's approving it, it's approving it. Okay. But when he's approving a question, if number of questions approved is greater than or equal to minimum questions required, right? So minimum questions required for testing. If this condition, whenever this condition is satisfied, only then it will go from disabled to enabled. So remember, this event is being shown on the superstate. That means it is applicable in all the substates as well. Okay. Now, what event will trigger this transition? Add subject. Yes. Add subject. What event will trigger this transition? That means going to inactive. The event would be deactivate, activate subject. Any condition? No condition required. Yes, guard condition would be no tests scheduled or running, right? There should not be any tests which have been scheduled or which are running. When will this come back? Okay, activate subject is the trigger. Any condition? No, nothing. Apart from that, there will be various other events that will be happening. Okay, add question, right? Effect would be number of questions added. Yes. Then reject question. Number of questions rejected plus plus. Now minimum question required. Let's go to browser and see whether we have that. No, we don't have. So that means we have to add it. Class diagram. And here we have to add a attribute. Min questions. What was that? Min question required. This should be underscore. As far as possible, be consistent. Number of questions added, number of questions rejected, all that is there. Okay, anything else that we can think of? So when he adds a subject, the subject gets added. No condition is required for this. Now experts would keep adding questions, approving questions, rejecting questions, and as part of that, counters will keep getting incremented, and time will be reached when the number of questions approved is greater than or equal to minimum question required. That time it will go from disabled to enabled. At some point in time, the training manager would deactivate the subject, saying no more, this subject is not required anymore. Now, when he tries to deactivate it, there should not be any tests which have been scheduled or running. Okay. Then if by mistake he deactivates it, he should be able to activate it again. Okay. Now, why this state machine is important? Mainly because to really understand the complete life cycle of an object, of an entity, we might have to develop multiple use cases, right? To understand it in a much better way at the beginning of the project itself, it's better to build a state machine diagram. That way we understand it in much more comprehensive manner without actually spending time on developing multiple use cases. Okay, now because there can be a confusion what is active, what is enabled, it's very essential that we properly document them. So number of questions to ask, all that is okay. Is enabled, initially what will it be? Remember, initially is enabled is true and is active is false. Is active is true and is enabled is false. It's not enabled for testing but is active. Okay, and not only that, we also need to provide proper documentation, so that some explanation, so that it is very clear what each of these means. So is active means that the subject is not used for training anymore, or is not used for training anymore. No tests shall be scheduled or executed for the candidates for this subject. Yes. Similarly, this would be what? The subject is having the minimum required number of approved questions so that the tests can be scheduled. Like that, we have to do it for these as well, for the expert class attributes. Once that is done, and remember this is going to take time. Now what about expert form? Now expert form will have attributes, need not necessarily be all the attributes, right? So only the relevant attributes may be shown on the expert form, only those that are really required. In our case, if we go back to the sequence diagram, subject list is going to be displayed on the expert form. So display subject list. When he selects a subject, the list of employees will be shown. He will make selections and everything else will happen in the background. Screen itself would be quite simple. So this will have a display for subject list, a display for employee list. Makes the selections. It will have submit, cancel, or one additional button, reset. So the selections can be removed. What about expert manager? Expert manager, currently during analysis we can just leave it as it is. These two again we'll treat them as black boxes. Okay, so that is analysis. Bye for now.